Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and good day to everyone. On behalf of the organizers, I'm delighted to welcome all the participants today to this session, an interesting conversation with Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar on Islamic finance and sustainability and the way forward. First, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker. Tan Sri Abdul Wahid is currently the chairman of Bursa Malaysia and University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Previously, he served as group chairman of PNB, Malaysia's largest fund management company. Prior to that, he had held top positions at several organizations in different sectors, including President and CEO of Maybank, Group CEO of Telecom Malaysia, and CEO of UEM Group. Having exhausted the private sector space, he ventured into public sector and was appointed as a senator and minister in the Prime Minister's department in charge of economic planning. In a nutshell, Tan Sri is one of the most versatile corporate leaders in Malaysia, and we are truly privileged to have him with us today. Assalamu alaikum, Tan Sri, and great to have you on this session. From inception, Islamic finance has been grounded on sustainability principles. Islamic finance has clearly distinguished between permissible sectors and prohibited sectors. On the social front, Islamic finance has prohibited various sectors which are harmful to the society, like gambling, alcohol, tobacco, arms and ammunition, and other sectors which have all been excluded. And Islamic finance is also interestingly, so just to bring back to the point, on the social front, many sectors which are harmful, like gambling, alcohol, tobacco, arms and ammunition, and others have all been excluded by Islamic finance. Interestingly, Islamic finance also view interest-based debt financing as unsustainable, and that is also prohibited. So in some aspects, Islamic finance has a broader perspective on sustainability, particularly on the social front. But on the environmental front, like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, avoiding deforestation, and so on, Islamic finance seems to have less of a focus compared to on the social front. So the first question I have, Tan Sri, is when we say Islamic finance is sustainable, is there a common definition or understanding on sustainability that is globally aligned, which Islamic finance can embrace?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and very good afternoon. Thank you, Sambi CGS, for inviting me to be here this afternoon. Very happy to be in the company of many investors today. Well, on the subject of ESG and Islamic finance and Shariah investment in particular, my view is that there's a lot of similarities between ESG and Islamic finance. And you mentioned some of it earlier. At the very core of it, if you talk about Islamic finance, it's about the attainment of the objectives of Sharia or Maqasid al-Sharia. And as you know, there are 5 elements to that. There's about preservation of faith or religion, preservation of life, intellect, property, and lineage as well. Now, when it comes to ESG, it is about taking into consideration the elements of environment, social, and governance issues in your investment making decisions. So when it comes to environment, you're talking about issues like climate change, resource depletion, waste, pollution, and deforestation. Social issues, talking about human rights issue, modern slavery, forced labor, child labor, working conditions, and employee relations. And when it comes to governance, we're talking about issues of bribery and corruption, executive pay issue, board diversity and structure, political funding, and even issues such as tax evasion and tax avoidance and so on. So my view is actually, when you understand these 2 principles, they're actually very much aligned. It's just that perhaps not much has been spoken about when it comes to the area of environment. But having said that, you know, this issue of environmental concern, climate change, is now very much on the mainstream agenda, if I may. So especially with the Conference of the Parties putting climate change issue on the global agenda. Rafi, if I may, come November this year, the UK, in partnership with Italy, will be hosting the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change in Glasgow. And this is where all the countries that have signed up to the Paris Agreement, there's more than 190 countries, they are expected to pledge or make a recommitment moving towards global net zero in terms of carbon emission by 2050 or 2060. At the same time, they're also talking about committing and reinforcing further reducing their net emissions by 2030, as well as committing to reduce or to maintain the increase in temperature within 1.5 degrees centigrade. So I would say between Islamic finance and ESG is very similar. And likewise, the issue of social as well, when it comes to modern slavery, forced labor, and so on, that's currently being faced by our manufacturing companies as well as some of our plantation companies as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri. I think you've articulated quite well, in terms of the parallels between the Maqasid al-Shariah and the ESG concept, particularly on the UN SDG front. And Islamic finance was well advanced. In the 11th century, the Islamic finance values have been clearly defined, that profit should be aligned with the purpose, and that purpose has been sort of dictated by this maqasid or higher objectives, which today's terms would be similar to the UN SDGs. Now, you've mentioned about the similarities, and to what extent you think maqasid is aligned with UN SDGs? Because, you know, we have 16 UN SDGs plus one where there's one for cooperation. While there's a lot of similarities, to what extent do you think UN SDGs are aligned with the Maqasid al-Shariah?
Well, thank you for that. So I think definitely you're talking about the 17 UN SDGs. Again, it talks about zero hunger, about the well-being of people, life on land and at sea, and so on. Again, to me, if you go back to that principle of life, faith, lineage, property, and intellect or akal, it's actually very much aligned. So Islamic finance is something which is very much against anything that's harmful to environment, to lives, livelihood, and so on. Definitely, it is certainly very much aligned with the SDG for me.
So in terms of the Islamic finance industry as a whole, a lot of banks from the conventional side has signed up to, for example, the UNEP-FI, particularly the UN Principles for Responsible Banking, and the funds have signed up to UNPRI. We are seeing more and more players signing up to the PRI and PRB. But among the Islamic banks, there is still some hesitance. Is there a need to nudge them to make, to show the similarities between SDGs and Maqasid and influence that change so that we can see more Islamic banks being part of this global movement to be aligned with SDGs, which we clearly believe it's in line with Maqasid, so that we can be part of the global movement and clearly set the targets so that we can focus on our both the operational impact as well as finance impact to the environment and to social factors.
Well, I would say there is progression. If you recall, the whole movement was started by a group of 60 over institutional fund managers and asset managers getting together back in 2006 and saying that, look, we need to drive this sustainability agenda moving forward. So, and that's actually known as what's known as the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, UNPRI. Now, that has progressed so well that today you have more than 4,000 signatories already, including almost all of the institutional fund managers here in Malaysia. So that started earlier, Rafi, and therefore that's gotten significant traction and movement. Now, next comes the UN Principles for Responsible Banking. So this is relatively new compared to the UNPRI. So the global banks have come on board, and I think we can expect more and more local banks to actually come on board as well. So I don't think many Malaysian banks have signed up as yet, but to me, just a matter of time. And whenever you have the 8 Malaysian banking groups, for example, signing up to this, and naturally their respective Islamic banking arms will come in as well. So it's just a matter of time, to my view. And the third element within the context of financial services is the UN Principles for Sustainable Insurance too. Now, as we progress, again, I will expect the takaful companies to also come on board. Yeah, just a matter of time.
Sure. And if you look at the funds today, there are lots of funds which are already being included in the, or stocks have been included in, say, Dow Jones Sustainability Index and other sustainability indices. In the past, we used to have the Islamic index or indices. Now we have the sustainability indices. Do you see, a time where we will see that convergence? Would Islamic finance or Islamic compliant or Sharia compliant stocks be somehow automatically be included in the sustainability index indices? Because, Islamic finance is aligned with the UN SDGs and other ESG factors.
Right. I mean, indeed, if you look at how we progress in terms of our sustainability index that we call FTSE for Good Bursa Malaysia index, when we started this journey in 2014, our basic premise would be all the constituents of the emas index, right? So from that, we will do the scoring in terms of how they fare in terms of all the elements of sustainability. Again, environment, social, and governance, and then they are then ascribed a score. So there's a rating, up to 5, and typically those companies in the past that's got a rating of 2.9 and above will, and if they meet the liquidity requirements, they will actually come under that. So we started with 24 stocks that fulfill that requirement. So today, as we speak, that number of constituents has grown to 76. Now, so that's actually the FTSE for Good, the conventional, if you like. Now, on 5th of July, we announced the Shariah version of that. So from that list of 76 companies, we then apply the Shariah compliant screening. And this is very much based on the ASIS Sharia Advisory Council screening methodology, which among others, apart from making sure that the activities are compliant with Sharia, it also looks at the riba element and also looking at the gearing element. So for example, it would exclude companies which has got gearing of more than 33%, for example. So that's why I'm saying that look, it's already aligned because the very basis of the FTSE for Good Sharia is actually from the FTSE for Good Bursa Malaysia index in the first place. And of course, there are gaps or differences in the sense that apart from the interest-based activities, there's also the alcohol-based activities, for example. So many of people actually highlighted to us when we reviewed the constituents last month. There were 4 counters that were removed from the index on liquidity reasons and so on. And there were 6 that were actually added on. And included in that 6 was Heineken, the manufacturer of beer and so on. And 2 of the 4 companies that were excluded were companies like IOI Property, as well as KLCC REIT. So people were asking, how do you justify dropping off these property companies, which are typically halal, and yet you include Heineken, which is non-Sharia compliant,
Right.
that is sustainable? Well, the issue here is actually the two Sharia compliant counters were dropped because of liquidity requirements. And within the context of the current definition of sustainability, alcohol-related companies are not considered not sustainable, so they can be consistent as long as they observe all the other elements of sustainability. But having said that, as we progress, I believe that over time there'll be greater calls for companies that are involved in alcohol consumption will probably not be deemed as sustainable in the future. Because I think globally, when you look at the UN SDG, I believe many people are saying that, look, alcohol companies are not consistent with the 14 out of the 17 UN SDGs, if I may.
That's right. Yeah. So there is, I mean, as you rightly pointed out, there's a growing amount of literature available today that has empirically studied the impact of addictive activities or substances like alcohol and gambling in particular, on the well-being of the community and family life and so on. And as you rightly pointed out, you won't be able to achieve many of the UN SDG goals, SDGs, if we still continue with BAU, business as usual, on certain sectors like alcohol and gaming. Now, given the context where there are lots of similarities between Islamic finance, Maqasid and the UN SDGs and some of the ESG factors, is it time for Islamic finance players to increase their standards? Where they are strong on the social, they can continue, but and on the governance side, probably they're on par. But on the environmental side, should there be a sort of a standard in the industry or for the industry where we all agree on this is what we mean by environmental standard for Islamic, and that could bring the Sharia sector or Islamic finance sector on par, or if not better than the sustainability sector on the conventional front?
Well, thank you for that. And I must say that it is important for whatever rules that we apply, it must be based on substance rather than just pure form. So again, when we talk about whether it's sustainability screening or whether it's Sharia screening, I think it's very important that we look at the substance. So for example, theoretically, you can have a poultry manufacturer that will raise the chicken and slaughter it in a halal way, in the sense that you have to cut the proper slaughtering method and so on. But if the way the poultry is actually raised is against the basic human animal rights standards and excessive use of antibiotics, for example, and in conditions which are not acceptable, and within the context of the Sharia world, it's not toiban, it's not clean, hygienic, and so on. So surely that will not be considered as Sharia compliant. And therefore, what I'm trying to say here is that you can apply all the sustainability screening and the Sharia screening, but it must be based on substance. And my view is actually, if you start to base it on substance, it comes very, very naturally that if you say that something is not sustainable, means that it cannot be cannot be halal.
That's right. Yeah. I think this discussion on halal and tayyib has been ongoing in the Islamic finance industry for around a decade now. And I think at the beginning, we were still trying to capture the extent of what we mean by tayyib. But now, having seen how sustainability as a practice has evolved on the conventional side, we now better understand what the Quran says, consume things which are halal and tayyib. Because by its own definition, something which is tayyib must necessarily be halal, but not everything that's halal would also be tayyib. So halal is at least the minimum standard, but the target for Muslims is to achieve the tayyib standard, which is what we mean today by sustainability. So Tansi, I want to move to another topic, which is given the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which is causing many challenges to the economy and to the society at large, and also to the planet as a whole. What do you think are the particular challenges that Islamic funds, Islamic banks, and Sharia compliant companies are facing due to this ongoing pandemic?
Well, in the first place, this pandemic has made all of us realize that it is important for us to look after our environment, because if we don't, and if we continue with our past ways of deforestation and ignoring the protection of wildlife, so there will be diseases that will actually jump from domesticated animals to wildlife, and vice versa. So from life jumping onto our domesticated animals, and of course to human being, as what's been reported as the cause of this pandemic. So I think it's actually very important for us to look after the environment very well. Now, having said that, we all know that this COVID-19 is causing untold damage to lives and livelihoods. And on livelihood, it's really painful. We've already seen, statistically, more than 150 million households being pushed into extreme poverty. And domestically here in Malaysia, in terms of the poverty incidence level, it has actually gone up from 5.6% in 2019 to 8.4% in 2020. And this is using the higher poverty line income level of 2,208 ringgit. So what that means actually, most people actually worse off compared to where we were. And naturally, for beyond individuals, business too have been affected. So when businesses and people are affected, naturally the banks will be similarly affected too, in terms of the liquidity and in terms of the repayment and asset quality and so on. And this is where whether you are a conventional bank or Islamic bank, I think in general the broad impact would be similar. I guess the difference is that because in Islamic banking, you do not have that element of compounding interest or penalty interest. So interest on interest, if you like. So the damage would be more contained compared to the impact of conventional, where you have penalty interest and so on. And I think this is where the guidance from the central bank, from the Ministry of Finance, on how banks are not supposed to, impose penalty interest on some payments. I think that's actually good guidance, if I may. So I would say, in general, overall, Islamic banks and conventional banks are both affected, and I think it's actually very important for banks to take a very constructive approach in addressing the predicaments of their clients. So the idea would be to lend as much support as possible to the people, especially to businesses, where possible, to keep them afloat, so that when the economy recovers, when the economy reopens, the capacity is still there for them to restart and for them to then start to rehire the employees. For those that already terminated the employees, or at the very least, those who are actually on half pay can be actually be reinstated onto full pay and so on.
Right. I think you've raised an important point. This pandemic has shown the importance of focusing or preserving the environment that we live in. But the challenge we face now is with the loss of livelihoods and the impact of the economy. Would there be enough what we call economic drive to focus also on the environment, given many economies have been destroyed because of the pandemic? And just to highlight, under COP21, the target was to reduce GHG emissions to around 44 billion tons by 2030 in order to hit the a 2 degrees Celsius target. Ideally should be 1.5 degrees Celsius, but I think with the current trajectory. So what happened is, in 2019 we had about 59 billion tons of CO2e. And in 2020, because of the various lockdowns globally, that number dropped to about 55 or 56 billion tons, but still way below the 44 billion target or 40 billion target that we are looking at for 2030. Now, with this current economic disruptions, would there be enough interest or economic, what we call capacity to progress on the environmental front, or governments will be more focused on reviving the economy and saving the livelihood and putting the environment at the back burner?
Well, I don't believe it's always mutually exclusive, meaning that you do one at the expense of the other. So meaning that if you're targeting for net zero, does it mean that it will be costly? Not in all circumstances. Yes, there are some technologies that are expensive, required to pursue the pathway towards net zero. But at the same time, with the advent of technology and over time, you find that what is sustainable is also cost effective. Yeah. So just take the example of solar power. You know, there was a time when the cost to generate solar power was actually higher than the grid parity. It was actually more than 36 cents. But over time, the cost has been driven down. Now, the cost of generating 1 kilowatt hour of solar power is actually less than 20 cents for sure. I think the last LS4 bidding was about 16 or 17 cents, if I recall the figure correctly. So it's actually well below the 5 US cents already, which is cheaper compared to gas-fired powered. So the point like to me here is actually it's not always more expensive. What's sustainable can be cost-effective, and certainly the same thing will apply for electric vehicles too. Obviously now it is more expensive, but with the continued advancement in battery and storage technology, I think the cost of ownership for electric vehicles would be expected to reach parity with the internal combustion engine vehicles in 2026. So the many countries that have made a commitment not to allow ICE vehicles on the road beyond 2030 would also be supported by economic considerations as well, because the cost of ownership overall will be lower by the end of 2030, hopefully. So again, this actually is a moving target, but if you see the progress of the many countries that have embraced it, like the UK, for example, you can actually see the range has increased tremendously, and therefore the cost per kilometer is actually much lower compared to ICE as we progress.
Mm-hmm. So we have received 3 questions from the chat box, Tan Sri. I'm going to pick only one given the limited time we have. This one is, Shariah screening often looks at negative screening, but ESG looks at both negative impact as well as positive impact. So, for example, certain emissions, GHG emissions need to be reduced. But at the same time, you need to progressively move towards, positive sectors. It could be renewable energy, it could be affordable homes, it could be financial inclusion. So there are targets on both sides. What we call Amru Ma'ruf wa Nahy al-Munkar, reducing the harm, increasing the benefits and reducing the harm. So is it fair to say that Islamic finance is only focusing on reducing the harm? Or it is also focusing on increasing the positive aspects? If yes, what are the targets and how do we actually measure them?
Well, a very good question, I must say. I think, again, I would like to go back to my earlier statement that when you talk about sustainability, it is universal in nature, all right? And by that, I mean that as we move forward, doing good is something universal, irrespective of religion and so on. And that's why with all the countries getting onto this global movement towards net zero, and hopefully by 2050 for most countries and some by 2060, you find that every single element of good will be taken into account, and not just reducing the harm, but also doing more of the good. And by that, what I would say would be that would become the base. So meaning that if you do something which is so-called Sharia compliant, but you do harm to the environment, you're not Sharia compliant in that sense. So I would say that the sustainability screening will be the base, and that will take into account both the positive and the negative. Only then you apply the negative Sharia screening. And to me, when you combine the two, it will be very much universal in nature, if I may.
Thank you, Tasri. I think we have come to the end of the session. I think you've covered all the topics well. What I've learned from this discussion is there's a lot of alignment, parallels between ESG and Maqasid. In some areas, Maqasid is having a greater focus. In some areas like environment, there could be probably more progress being made on the Islamic side. And also to include both the negative screening as well as positive impact screening, so that we have an alignment between the two. And I think the market, the demand will drive the behavior. I think more and more investors are looking for ESG compliant investments, and this will shape the behavior of the people, and this pandemic is likely to accelerate this trend. So thank you again, Tan Sri, for having you here on this session, and really delighted to hear your insights on this pertinent issue, and really looking forward to meeting you again.
Well, thank you, Rafiq, for that. Appreciate pleasure is mine. And remember, don't just focus on the form, but more importantly, look at the substance and stay constructive, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.
Well said. Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.